Hello, welcome back to The Rationalist. Today I'd like to talk about the economic problems of the COVID virus. And I think you probably know that right now Congress is bashing it out over exactly how much they should do in a second aid bill. Remember, they've already done one. And the questions seem to fall around not if there should be an aid bill, but just how much should be in it. And as usual, there's no talk about how to pay it off. Shouldn't a bill to spend money also contain some requirements on how to pay for it? That's how you and I live. If we can afford something, we buy it. If not, unless it's a car or a house, we don't borrow. But it's a little different. This leads to a little bit of talk about the national debt, and we've already discussed that, so I'm not going to go into any length on that. But why is our debt so high? Well, the basic answer is just because it can be. There's no balanced budget amendment. A lot of people would like to see that, including myself, but there isn't one. But at the state level, pretty much every state has a requirement that they have a balanced budget. So that means that they have to, come up with solutions that the federal government doesn't. They can't just keep borrowing their way out of debt. So today I want to talk about this state debt. And I live in New York State, so I'm going to use it as an example, but this applies to all states. And New York State is a very good one to use as an example because we have the highest levels of debt in the nation of any state. New York State has the highest debt to GDP ratio of any state. And this year, the state is predicting a $16 billion deficit. That was $6 billion of deficit before the COVID virus hit, and now an additional 10. So that's 16 billion out of a budget of roughly 150 billion. So you can see that that's a real problem. So if you have this level of debt, how does the state plan on fixing the problem? Well, if it's you or me, what you do is you have to cut spending. But no, that's not what our state does. They will never cut spending. Instead, they borrow. They just borrow more, but also, this is key. The legislature gave the governor the ability to cut state spending to schools and local governments. In other words, pass the buck on. Just like they have with Medicaid and welfare and other things, they pass the buck on and say, here's some requirements, but you have to pay for it, not us. So you can see the problem that we're coming to here. And here's something I find to be an interesting fact. New York State has the highest debt levels in the nation. We also spend the most on welfare, and our governor is paid more than any other governor. Do you see the relationship? The more you spend, the more you promise, the more you make. This is how politicians get reelected, by promising things that can't be afforded. You and I can't do it, but the politicians can. So if New York's got a debt of over $151 billion, which is slightly more than we spend each year, how does this happen? I mean, wait, didn't I just say that there's a balanced budget requirement? So how could they have a debt? Well, it's very simple. They borrow. They sell bonds. And these bonds do not go on the books as state debt. It should. Anything that you and I owe in debt is part of our budget, part of our balance sheet, isn't it? But not for the state. They've gotten around it with these borrowing rules. So they keep selling these bonds, and that $151 billion in debt, by the way, it doesn't include unfunded pension liabilities. It's just payments that we know exactly how much we have to pay. But if you include those unfunded pension liabilities, it's up over $400 billion. Yeah. Now, if you're spending $150 billion a year and you've got $400 billion in debt, how are you going to pay that off? Frankly, you're not going to. But this is the thing. The politicians keep kicking the can down the road and saying, we'll let the next generation pay for it. We'll just keep promising more and more. And that's exactly what they've done. And New York is the worst example of what many states are doing, taking on debt that they can't. But they just keep putting bond issues up for the voters when you go in, and they don't tell everybody how much it adds to the debt, and the voters go, oh yeah, I want to build that bridge, or oh yeah, I want technology for schools, or whatever, so they say yes. So the voters are to blame, but it's all started by the governor and the legislature. So if you're the governor of New York, what do you do about these problems? The best thing to do would be cut spending, but of course that will never happen. So what do? You blame other people. That's right, and nobody's better at blaming other people than New York's Governor Cuomo. And he blames people for everything. Nothing is his fault. But as an example, for many years, taxpayers in high tax states like New York were able to deduct the state taxes that they paid off of their federal income taxes. So think about that. If I'm in New York and I have a high income and I'm deducting the amount of taxes I pay to the state off of my federal taxes, then the people in the low tax states like Florida or many others are really subsidizing everybody in New York, aren't they? Yeah, they're subsidizing us because we're able to deduct our taxes off federal income taxes. We therefore pay less federal tax at the same income level as somebody in a low tax state. Is that fair? Of course not. So a few years back, President Trump put through a tax bill that eliminated that deduction. What it did was put every state on an equal footing. You can't deduct your state taxes from your federal taxes. Everything's fair now. Well, people in California and New York and places that are high taxes, oh my gosh, did they complain. Cuomo the loudest of all, of course, because what has happened? Well, the people who have high incomes have moved to low income states because now they can't deduct their taxes, so they're ending up paying more. So they go, you do like a business. You move to wherever is most economically viable for you. Well, that didn't seem fair to Cuomo and everybody else because the high income people are all leaving, reducing the taxes that the state has, the income that the state has. Well, wouldn't it make sense to cut your tax rate? That way people wouldn't move out of state. You'd have them in state for a lot of valuable reasons, including the income they give. But no, we will never cut taxes. We will never cut spending. That's not how you get elected. It's the right thing to do, but it's not something that our state is willing to do. But it's fair, and that's what it should be. I mean, you can complain about other things in the tax law, but making it fair for every individual in every state, what's wrong with that? So now we come back to the COVID virus. This has depressed economic activity, as we all know, and so it's hurt revenues at all levels of government, local, state, federal. So what do we do about that? Well, the localities and the states are crying for relief and saying, we can't, borrow more money, so we need the federal government to bail us out. Should that happen? I don't know. I'm going to leave that question for you, but I would give you this thought. I think that if you want to stimulate the economy, giving money to individuals and businesses is the best way to do it. Governments are terribly inefficient. So I would rather see that money go to individuals and businesses than to other governments. I think it's, local or state governments. I just think it makes more sense. So let's say that we are going to help them. And again, we'll use New York here as an example. New York has gotten into a very bad fiscal situation. Frankly, they're not going to be able to get out of it easily. I think the only option is eventually, New York and Illinois certainly also will have to declare bankruptcy. That's a bad thing, but it's a lot better than the federal government declaring bankruptcy because they gave so much money to the states that they had to. You can't have the federal government declaring bankruptcy. That leads to incredible problems. But on a state level, you can. Still a problem, but that's what happens. If a business or a person ends up not having enough money to pay off their debts, they declare bankruptcy. It gives them a clean slate, a fresh start. They can move on. And so I think that's the kind of thing we need to look at. Now, I don't want them to declare bankruptcy, but we may have to. So let's say that we do decide to help the states out. Again, up to you whether or not we should. But because of their fiscal ineptitude, do we just give them money and say, spend it any way you want? They've already proven they can't do that well. And remember that in our state, the governor has been given the ability to cut education spending. Now think about that. I think everybody agrees education spending is one of the most important things the state does. And that's where the vast bulk of education spending comes from anyway. The federal government gives a very small amount to that. So if they blame others, if they play the blame game, then what they do is they say, oh, I'm sorry, we have to cut state aid to education because the feds wouldn't bail us out. And they do that, and it creates a big cry from the populace. And what can they do? Raise taxes. That's what they want to do. So suppose the aid bill that's going through Congress right now, that they give money to the states. But what they do is they put a very specific requirement in there. The requirement is, if you accept this money, New York State, then you have to agree not to reduce spending on education. It must remain at least the same or greater than it was in the previous year. Well, that might be interesting to do. Then you're helping the states, you're helping education by keeping things at the same level, and you're not bailing out the states for their ineptitude. Of course, the states wouldn't like that very much, would they? But it would make sense. Just like lowering taxes if you're spending too much money. So anyway, I think bankruptcy is coming for the states, but let's not bail them out of that. That's their own problem. Okay? So I've used New York State as an example, but this applies to a lot of states. Illinois, California. Actually, California is not too bad on debt, but they have quite a few other problems. But all these states need to think about how to get their budgets on track, to get debt eliminated, and the federal government bailing them out is not the answer that I see. So there's some thoughts for you today. I hope you'll do me a favor, leave some comments back on the Rationalist website what you think about this. As always, when you subscribe, you'll find out when we release a new edition of this. Like us, Facebook every place else, and thank you for taking the time to listen. Have a great day. Bye.